So tell me, Monty, how are we going to go about doing this? We've got 1 hour.
Yeah, so I think that we will just wait sort of 5 or so minutes to let people come in, and then you will give your talk, and then do you think you have sort of 10 minutes at the end for some questions? Thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah. Sounds
Brilliant.
good.
That would be perfect. So I'll just yeah, I say we wait 3 minutes and then you go right ahead, and then brilliant.
Yeah. Very good.
Okay. Hey guys. I think we should start now so that we have time for questions at the end. But I think people will be filtering in as you talk, Thomas. So please go ahead.
Right. Okay. So thank you, and thanks for the invitation. So this is a slightly improvised talk, but it's about a topic that I think we should all be engaged with, and I'm hoping also to show this afternoon ways in which archaeology and anthropology may actually have something important to contribute at this particular time regarding identity, politics, collectives, and nationalism. So the title that I've given myself is this: Nationalism and Climate Change, part of the problem or part of the solution? I mean, at the outset, it seems that the answer is pretty straightforward. Nationalism is part of the problem. And I'm not going to oppose that view very strongly, but I will try to problematize it a bit as we go along. The fact is that in the standard literature on nationalism and on identity, climate change is not really part of the equation. The 20th century was characterized by a great interest in inequality and in bureaucracy and in capitalism which is fine. But the Anthropocene shift, the shift towards a greater concern with what we're doing with the environment and the unintentional consequences of modernity have been much, much more predominant in the present century, in the last, say, 20 years or so. If we take all the canonical texts, I'm going to refer to a few of them later on, but let me just mention canonical texts in the literature on nationalism and collective identity. The first person that may come to mind is Ernest Gellner, whose book Nations and Nationalism from 1983 identified the Industrial Revolution as a driving force in nationalism. He did not mention coal. He could have. The Industrial Revolution relied to great extent on fossil fuel, the kind of energy which is now causing us so much trouble where we are now for environmental reasons. Another important theorist of nationalism from the last decades of the 20th century, Eric Hobsbawm, is actually the only one to really predict in so many words that nationalism would wane, it would go away, it would be superseded by something else. Hobsbawm had a Marxist analysis, and his view was basically that because of the contradiction between globalized capital and the limitations of the nation state, it will go away because of the capital is globalized and politics is national, and they don't fit. So the nations will be overrun by global capitalism. This did not happen. Well, it hasn't happened yet. My view is rather that the nation state and nationalism is seriously threatened by the cumulative effects of what I call treadmill contradictions. I'm coming to that. The treadmill contradictions, treadmill competition between nation states, which is incredibly destructive at a time when we have to find solutions to global problems. So just as the main contradiction in parts of the 19th and most of the 20th century by many social theorists was seen as being that between labor and capital, I would argue, as I am in a forthcoming article in the journal Anthropology today, that the fundamental contradiction in today's world is between growth and sustainability. And this, is where our disciplines come in, because we can posit and formulate alternatives. We can find alternative ways out. The contradiction between growth and sustainability. You can't have it both ways. It's very hard to see. I know politicians and other elites speak about green growth, but honestly, we haven't seen much of it yet, have we? There's been greenwashing. There have been some symbolic victories. There is more renewable energy, but it's too little and too late. And the consumption of coal in the world is still increasing quite rapidly. So the kind of issue that theorists of collective identity and of global questions and of nationalism need to take seriously now are to do with the environment and climate. Today, what we see as what I call Anthropocene effects are the results of the way in which humanity is transforming the planet. And nationalism has not been very helpful in mitigating these effects. Now, this is an image of many of you, certainly archaeologists, would be familiar with the image of the Ouroboros. The Ouroboros, the snake that eats itself through the tail. In fact, Ouroboros-like creatures or mythical creatures exist in many cultures, but in our part of the world, we trace it back to Egypt. And Ouroboros in Egypt was a symbol of fertility and rebirth, almost like, the bird, the phoenix, that burns up and then it arises from the ashes, reborn. I would rather interpret it as something much more sinister, that we have a world system which is eating itself now from the inside, or through the tail, if you prefer. So the situation we are seeing now regarding collective identities and Anthropocene effects and growth is what I have spoken of also in other contexts as treadmill competition between nation states. Some of you will be familiar with this image, some not, or some would recognize it. This is from Through the Looking Glass. It's a second book about Alice. It's not Alice in Wonderland, it's the other one called Through the Looking Glass, where Alice encounters the Red Queen. And the Red Queen is a nasty person. And Alice is being told that she should run as fast as she can. Otherwise, off with her head or something. So she runs as fast as she can, but she keeps standing in the same place. She doesn't move. And then she says to the Queen, Your Majesty, in my kind of society where I live, when you run, you actually move from one place to another. And then the Red Queen responds that, no, but here, you see, you have to run as fast as you can in order to stay in the same place. To Lewis Carroll, this was a metaphor of competition, where in order to keep your place, you have to change, and also of evolution. He was, Lewis Carroll was deeply interested in evolution, and he was well read in science, Darwin, and so on. And so it's about having to change, having to innovate, having to grow, having to move, just to keep your place in the hierarchy. And as long as there is treadmill competition between nation states, and as long as that is predominant, it's very hard to see how it will be able to find global solutions to questions to do with climate and environment. I have to apologize for my voice. I'm not, as you may notice, I'm not in great shape. Okay, so you just have to bear with me. I'm actually quite ill, but I'll manage. So some countries have formed alliances. For example, during the recent summit meeting on climate, there was an agreement not to expand oil exploration, signed by countries like Denmark, Costa Rica, and a few others. But that was a fairly sensational move, and it has not really caught on, has it? Because countries look at other countries, nation states, governments, they look at other nation states and governments, and they try to keep the place in the hierarchy. And in order to do that, they have to grow, they have to expand. And this is a belief, it's a mantra which is shared very widely across the political spectrum, from left to right. The belief in growth is fairly universal. There are dissenting voices. There will be more of them in the years to come, but they are still quite feeble. Because what we've seen, and what we've seen in recent years is, in fact, we may have seen a few steps back regarding the possibility to do anything on a global scale. There's been a clear, perceptible weakening of multilateralism. Nationalism is on the rise. Nationalist, what I call nationalist withdrawal from international cooperation. It's very easy. You can read about it every day in the newspapers. The way in which China and Russia are now maybe possibly forming an alliance. And there is a lot of volatility in the global system. The United Nations is no longer seen as an important force in world politics. The World Health Organization, they could say what they liked during the pandemic, which they did, but it wasn't necessary to take much notice of it, which it would have been some decades ago. So multilateralism is being weakened, which could have been an antidote, and has been in the past, to nationalist withdrawal and treadmill competition between nations, cooperation rather than competition, which is exactly what we're going to need if we're going to get out of this dead end. And to take events from the last year, Russia's Ukrainian war doesn't also exactly help with anything like a green transition. In 2022 and the beginning of 23, energy prices are more of a concern in politics around the world than ecological sustainability and climate. I think it's easy to see. In my own country, Norway, which is a war profiteering country, they're expanding the production of oil and gas in order to make as much money as they can during the war. And they're also exploring for new oil fields in the far north. So make no mistake, Anthropocene effects are still accelerating, and solutions may not be found, and they certainly will not be found in treadmill competition between states. Yet at the same time, we have to take nationalism seriously, because to many it's the air that they breathe. It's existentially important to them. You cannot just decide that as from tomorrow, we're no longer going to be nationalists. We're going to be globalists or cosmopolitans or members of an ecological Gaia community. It's not going to happen. So nationalism, some in one way or another, will, for the time being, have to be part of the solution. But it will have to be a different kind of nationalism. And it's interesting here to take a step back and look at some of those classic texts on nationalism again. Ernest Gellner's main sort of watershed, what he calls the big ditch. The big ditch to Gellner is a transition from agrarian society to industrial society, which, as I said, it was fueled by coal. In this seminal book that everybody should read. I mean, and you don't really have to be particularly interested in Central European history or nationalism, but it's a great book about the economic and political history in especially in Europe. And to Gellner, the transition was to do with the change in the division of labor, urbanization, the functional need for an ideology that could hold people together after they had been alienated from their villages or from their rural homes and thrown into this urban cauldron of factories and shops and strangers and so on. So you needed this abstract ideology. That in a book published in the same year as Nations and Nationalism, the historian Benedict Anderson explains in detail in a book called Imagined Communities, which is often misunderstood because Anderson doesn't talk about imaginary communities. He talks about communities which are constructed in such a way that you have to use your imagination for them to exist. And he assumes that in small kinship-based societies of the kind that anthropologists used to study, and some still do, and that archaeologists do research on, the community was not imagined because it was based on face-to-face interaction. I think that's a problematic view. I'm not going into it here, but Anderson's point was that you can get anonymity, you can get a strong sense of identification with millions of others through the force of the print media, what he calls print capitalism. So that's that's a corollary, and it's very compatible. It fits Gellner's theory of nationalism really well. But what is happening now? What comes next after Industria? Is it Siberia, as some would have? I mean, not Siberia in Russia, okay, but Siberia, CYB, okay, the cyber community. Do we get the cyber society where people identify through the digital? Well, some of us thought that this might come about in the 1990s when the internet was new and cable satellite TV was fairly new, at least its ubiquity and easy access to global TV was quite new. Some of us thought that, well, this is going to weaken, following Anderson's theory, it's going to weaken national attachment. And it didn't. On the contrary, it strengthened national attachment. People became more concerned with showing who they were and where they were from when they were thrust into this global cyberspace. Not everybody, but that was a main trend. I mean, there's a great book by a colleague of mine, Danny Miller, from Trinidad around the year 2000, how Trinidadians became really obsessed with showing to the world what Trinidad was like and what being Trini was, etc. So they felt a lot more Trinidadian after they got internet than they had before, according to Danny Miller. And I think it's probably right. So what are we transitioning to after Industria, after the end, as it were, if we can envision an end, not an end of the world, but an end of over-reliance on fossil fuels? Is it just the Anthropocene, where we have to think differently about our relationships to nature and perhaps with each other? Will it be in post-nationalism? Are we transitioning into a post-national, post-state kind of world? This hasn't been explored properly in the literature, and I think it could. And I think our professions are well positioned to contribute because we know about alternatives. But my colleague, the sociologist Daniele Conversi is one of the few scholars of nationalism who has actually taken on the challenge of climate change and tried to find out. He's written articles about, for example, some secessionist movements in Scotland and Catalonia, which are quite green, which, we try to shift the economy and the way of life towards a sustainable kind of adaptation. And he's also written about this historical drift towards greater social complexity, asking what comes afterwards. And Daniele has a chapter in this book, which is available open access, and which, again, it tells us not only about nationalism, but it tells us something about the way societies work. So we may envision a reversal. There's been a historical drift that many of you are studying, right? And you're looking at towards greater social complexity. That has been the tendency, not throughout human history, of course, but let's say in the last 10,000 years in many parts of the world, and not just in Europe, not just in Asia. We see the same tendency in the Americas towards greater social complexity, a more complex division of labor, more advanced technology, and the ability to support larger populations. And at a certain point, let's say in the late 18th, early 19th century, in the UK and in a few other countries, parts of the United States, Germany, Belgium, it shifted again towards industrial and led to the beginnings of the world in which we live now, where the population on the planet has increased eightfold in 200 years. It was about 1 billion at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Now we're 8 billion, thanks to the coal, thanks to the technological and scientific advances, which are piggybacking on the power of fossil fuels. So that's the world in which we live, and the world in which the nation state relies, the world of code, capitalism, and abstract imagined communities. So the big question we need to ask now is, where are we going? I think it's fair to ask that question at the place where we are now, because we're no longer talking about climate change as something which might happen in the future. It's happening now with droughts, not just south of the Alps that we've been somehow accustomed to, but last year there were severe droughts, and you know that if you live in England, in most of England, in Germany, elsewhere. A third of Pakistan was flooded just a few months ago, etc. So it's not as if this is something that's happening in the future. And we need to be prepared for fairly radical changes, because maybe we will see a reversal of the drift towards greater social complexity. And that's where people like us come in, like anthropologists and archaeologists who know quite a bit. We know more than most about how to organize the society with reduced social complexity. There's a very good book by an archaeologist. I see if I can put the title down here. I forgot it. Let's see if I can put it here. By Joseph Tainter. Some of you would know it. Yeah, here we are. Tainter, sorry about that. The of complex. It was a source of inspiration for the much more famous book, the bestseller just called Collapse by Jared Diamond, which came a number of years later. Tainter's book is from the late 1980s. And one of his conclusions, after having studied all of these societies that collapsed for various reasons, not just environmental, not just the overexploitation of resources, but that was certainly a factor in most of the cases he's looking at, from the Maya to the Roman Empire and to a number of less known cases. His conclusion is that when a complex society, such as an empire or a big state, when it collapses, because sooner or later it's going to happen, the Romans didn't think that it would happen, because their society, first a republic and then an empire, it had been chugging on for nearly a millennium. So why should it collapse? It's always been there. Well, it did. And what he says is that what happens when these complex societies collapse is really that humanity just returns to what is the default state of humanity, the small scale society based on, subsistence, food production, and on a simplified political organization, and on less mobility and less technological innovation. So maybe this is something we might want to be prepared for. But let's look at some other scenarios, a bit beyond, or perhaps complementing the very real possibility that we are looking at the future where the nation state will be less powerful, simply for lack of resources, and possibly for other reasons as well that we don't like to think about, and where social organization and identities will be organized along different lines. So another scenario could be this: the networked, decentralized world of sideways scaling. One of the big debates around climate change and environmental issues concerns whether we need to scale up or scale down in order to deal properly with them. Scaling up means relying on international agreements, handshaking in five-star hotels and signing documents, committing you to do this, that, and the other. Well, very few countries have actually been able to live up to any of those commitments that they've agreed to. Or should one scale down to the small scale, to the village, to the locality, since that's where people live most of the time. Perhaps we could also imagine, with the help of this technology, sideways scaling, which I think is interesting, and I'm writing a bit about it in my book, Overheating, and also in some later publications. Sideways scaling through networks, nodes, fairly small entities that are connected across the world and that form a community. An imagined community, but not an imagined community which is territorial. The eco-village network is one interesting example here, which uses this deterritorialized new technology extensively in order to stay in touch and to coordinate their efforts. So that would be another way of producing political and collective identities, which goes beyond the limitations of the nation state and which also transcends the hopeless distinction or the impossible option of choosing between scaling up and scaling down. Now, the link between capitalism and nationalism is quite clear historically. Capitalism relies on nationalism. Nationalism relies on capitalism. They are Siamese twins. And there is a literature on this as well. There's a book that was just published on capitalism and nationalism, which shows this pretty convincingly. And since growth capitalism is unsustainable, I mean, everybody knows this by now, it cannot last. It's easy to calculate how bad things could get. You've all seen these graphs that sort of go like this, the exponential growth in anything from the amount of plastic in the ocean to air pollution, to species extinction, which is immense. Since 1970, we've gotten rid of something like nearly 70% of all the vertebrates in the world. Not all the species, but the vertebrates in biomass. Vertebrates, fish, birds, reptiles, mammals, anything with a spine is a vertebrate, 68%. So, and we've reached a point where this image of the Ouroboros becomes more relevant than it has been for a long time, because the very condition for our success is its failure. You see, we have to undermine the conditions for our own success in order to succeed. So here we are. I'm not sure if we can. Yes, I think we can use the term progress. Go into the future, but a different future than the one to the left. And how is that going to do? How is that going to happen? Degrowth in economics is now coming up, and my prediction is that degrowth economics is going to be taken far more seriously in the next few years than it has been until now. When most economists have been adamant that growth is necessary in all economies, but when you reach a point where it's quite clear that the economy destroys more than it produces, that it's inherently destructive, more plastic in the ocean than there is fish, that kind of thing, you reach a tipping point where you must realize that we need to think differently. So perhaps degrowth. And I think, to me, one of the most striking cases of the limitations of nationalism is to do with the controversial and problematic and yet important debates about population growth. I think most politicians agree that 8 billion is okay. I mean, we don't really need to be 18 billion in the world, especially when everybody wants an iPhone and a nice holiday and a steak dinner now and then. It's not going to work. So maybe even a slight reduction in the world population would be good, but not here. Everybody else should reduce their population, but we need to grow. Very clearly, here we need probably some. We're going to need some coordination, possibly in the future. So I'm using the word reversal many times now. A reversal of complexity, a decomplexification in some ways, and what are the implications for social identities and so on, which I put here on the slide. Either way, whichever path we choose, we should be prepared. And your generation, you're much younger than me. I'm in my 60s. I'm on my way out of this. I'm going to be able to observe this from the care home, from my wheelchair. But you have to live through it, and it's happening now. We should be prepared for fairly comprehensive changes. And nationalism, if it's going to rule the roost, it's going to be a major obstacle if it's not counteracted both from above and from below. Above, multilateralism, cosmopolitan identities. From below, the local, the regional, that which gives people a sense of attachment. And I thought I had a quite nice quotation. Oh, yes, I did. Here, I've got a nice quotation. I'll take it now. Anyway, I'll take it in a minute. So the relevance of our contributions are quite obvious, because few academic professions know more about human diversity than archaeologists and anthropologists. And it's no coincidence that the book about the collapse of complex societies, which still is the most probably authoritative book about the transition from a great deal of complexity to much less complexity, was written by an archaeologist. No coincidence at all. And I would also say that it's no coincidence that some of the classic historians of antiquity, are pretty worried now, because they see the signs. They've seen the collapse of the Roman Empire, and they recognize many of the same tendencies today. So we've got a lot to work with, but we also have positive. We have best case scenarios. We have good examples of sustainable societies with a high quality of life, and which may give us ideas to build on. I'm not saying that we should become hunters and gatherers. I'm not saying that we should revert to agraria, but that we should learn something from other ways of organizing your social identities and your belonging and your responsibilities. So what about nationalism then? Some of you may wonder, where does this come from? I was a bit proud of it. I made it this morning. Well, I didn't make it. DALL-E made it, okay? The AI generator of art, which is great fun. So I asked DALL-E, just make a painting of nationalism and climate change. And he came up with 4 alternatives, and this was the best one. I think, I can't really interpret the creative imagination of DALL-E, but you see the flags, you see the boundaries, but you also see some dark areas here, which indicate that there is something which is not quite right on the planet. It's evocative. I liked it. So DALL-E did this in about 20 seconds for me. Now the sociologist, there's something wrong about I didn't finish one of the sentences, but never mind that. The sociologist Daniel Bell, the late Daniel Bell, who was a really visionary, really creative, and original American sociologist, and quite far-sighted. And he was one of those sociologists who was interested in the future. And he said as early as the 1970s, sorry about my voice, medical treatment has its side effects, just like capitalism and the fossil fuel economy. And he said that, the problem with the nation state is that it's too small for some tasks and too big for others. It's too large to give you a sense of community, and it's too small to solve the global issues that are facing us. And he didn't think about the environment. He thought about global inequality, about war and peace, about poverty, about those infections, diseases, and so on. So that's, I would say that this is where we are now. Going back to the classic literature on nationalism, we can see that it gives credible, if debatable, but credible and good accounts of the transition from agrarian society, feudalism, from the society, that Karl Marx described as a society of the hand mill, to the society of the steam mill. He said that the hand mill, in one of his most technologically deterministic statements, Marx said that, the hand mill creates a society of feudal landowners, whereas the steam mill creates a society of industrial capitalists. So he saw that increasing complexity in front of his own eyes in the mid-19th century. So they gave credible accounts of the transition from agrarian to industrial society, to urban society, and to some extent of some of the tensions surrounding globalization. But so far, nationalism has had little to tell us about the new global challenges, which superimpose themselves on almost everything now to do with environmental destruction. And where everybody agrees, and they've agreed for a long time, that we're in a hurry, we have to do something, and we're in the double bind. So one of the most striking examples of that double bind, where you are trying to have your cake and eat it too, came from our ex-prime minister in Norway, a man I respect very highly, and I know him personally, who's now General Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. When he was the Prime Minister of Norway, he did all he could. He's an economist. He did all he could to expand Norwegian oil and gas production, make it grow, make the economy grow, produce more prosperity, win votes, make the Labour Party great again, etc. And then he lost an election, you see. So the Conservatives took over government. And for a few months before moving to Brussels, he was a sort of temporary traveling climate spokesman for the United Nations. And I remember Jens Stoltenberg, featured really looking old and wrinkled and worried on the front page of the largest newspaper in Norway, saying that climate change is taking place. It's happening now. And we've got to do something, and we've got to do it immediately. Otherwise, things will go really bad. And many of us then thought, why didn't he say this just a few months earlier when he still had the power to do something about it? Well, the answer is that he couldn't, because he was handcuffed. He was in a straitjacket. He was in the pocket of the industry. He had so many alliances that he had to maintain, and so many commitments he had made to industry that it was impossible for him. Only when he was a free person, after no longer having political responsibility, could he say these things. And this is not an attempt to criticize Jens Stoltenberg. It's just because I think we all find ourselves to a greater or less extent in that double bind, and the way to remove ourselves from it will have to consist in finding alternatives to nationalism as a way of organizing your identity and your society. So that's where we are. I'm saying degrowth, scaling sideways, and finding ways of living sustainably without reducing our quality of life too much. So we need to slow down. Slowing down an overheated world. And I think, one typical, thing that people tell each other is don't just sit there, do something. And maybe we should turn that on its head again as well. Many things need to be turned around now. We need to think new. So don't just do something, sit there. It's a far more sustainable, it's climate neutral, way of living, simply because certain things can only be done slowly, and because slowness is as endangered as the panda and the planet. And remember that we have lots of knowledge about alternatives in our disciplines. I'm not saying that we have the solutions, but we have the questions, and we have ideas, and we have alternatives, and we should now put them to use. So I stop here. I'm sure I could have spoken for another 5 minutes, but I said I'm seriously under the weather. I was taken off the chemo yesterday, and it's now making itself felt. So I'm going to having to go home and lie on my couch in a little while. But before then, feel free to ask questions, and maybe there are objections or people who have other ideas about where we're going and where we should be going. So thank you so far for your attention. I now turn off the Brezi.
Thomas, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking so soon after you finished your treatment. And it's an honor to have you here. And if you want, we don't have to do the questions now if you want to go home early. But if you're open to a Q&A.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Absolutely, I'm open to a Q&A.
I'll open it to the members. I have some questions, but I don't want to hog the mic. So if anyone else has a question, please put your hand up and speak. Okay, I'll start off with a question then.
You go ahead.
Could you elaborate on sideways scaling? I'm not really sure I understood that concept really well.
Yeah. No, I can. Yes, I can say a bit about that. And but first of all, there are limitations for certain tasks. We're certainly going to need, in the foreseeable future, something that resembles the state in complex societies, because you can scale down as much as you like. You can have as many eco villages as you like, and they can be connected globally, but they're not going to be able to fund your hospital or your university, or to give you your social security to the extent that you got that. So you've got to have a state. But the tasks and the job, the responsibility of the state might be decentralized. The state will have to accept to share the stage with other powerful political entities, such as the transnational environmental movement, various NGOs, hopefully not too many corporate, but surely, I mean, the corporate world is also important here. So scaling up, that means that you create a hierarchical organization which fuses together entities which were formerly separate. It's what happens when small communities are being incorporated into a state or an empire. They are being, you're being scaled up suddenly. You used to live in a small village in Ruritania, and you're being incorporated into megalomania, the big new state. These are terms from Ernest Kellner. And suddenly you discover that you can travel to the capital of megalomania and find a job there. That's scaling up your life. And this is happening as we sit here and speak in places like New Guinea, where people who live in small villages along rivers in New Guinea, someone gets an outboard motor for their boat, and suddenly traveling to the nearest town no longer takes several days. It takes just a few hours, and that scales up your world. You become a member of a larger world. You become incorporated, and you get your smartphone, you get your WhatsApp and your Facebook, and suddenly you're integrated at a high level. So we know scaling up, but scaling up is also multilateralism, international agreements, trade agreements, the European Union, and that sort of thing is scaling up. And scaling down is Brexit, of course. Let's not talk about that now. Whereas, so we know about scaling up and scaling down. Scaling sideways is the third alternative, where you do not replace the small communities or the locality, which are fairly autonomous, or the local branch of the NGO with something big and hierarchical, with a central office building somewhere in London. But instead you have electronic networks that connect you. on a more lateral basis, on a more, you might say, egalitarian and equitable basis. So that would be, and that is a kind of affordance that the mobile phone gives us. And I think we can think of many examples of scaling sideways. Some have been waxing lyrical about the new face of capitalism. And for a long time, they spoke about Uber and Airbnb as examples of the new kind of capitalism, which is about scaling sideways. You have a flat that you're not using, and you put it on Airbnb, and millions of people around the world do the same thing, but on a very small scale. It's just my flat, but I'm part of this, global sideways network. People are less enthusiastic now because they see some of the side effects, but as a model, it's quite interesting to emulate and to think about the possibility of organizing political activity and identity also along those lines. Not replacing what we have, but supplementing it. And perhaps in the long run, we won't have any other choice than replacing it. I mean, Daniele Conversi, who's written about this quite a bit, he reckons that nation states are simply going to become economically unsustainable because they're not going to be able to afford to provide the services that they have done so far because of environmental destruction. He's a bit more pessimistic than me.
Does anyone else have a question for Dr. Eriksen?
Well, we're just a small handful of people here, so I'm perfectly comfortable with not that. This is work in progress. I recommend this open access book to anybody who's interested, because it also says something about complexity. And there's a funny thing about nationalism studies. Looking at it sociologically. Okay, I'm part of several of these sort of academic networks that do different things. When we do diversity, creolization, multiculturalism, that sort of thing, we have very mixed groups, people from various backgrounds, many from ethnic minorities, lots of women. Whereas with studies of nationalism, the vast majority of scholars who study nationalism are white men between now, I think, 55 and 80. So in the book that I showed you, you've got lots of white men between 55 and 80. And this also means that they or we represent a particular slice, a particular historical moment in social theory. And your generation are going to have to move forward. And in order to do that, you have to know what we were up to. There are people there who are discussing Max Weber, the economic historian Karl Polanyi, the Great Transition, and we are still concerned, with how to organize industrial society. Whereas you, and perhaps some of the rest of us, will have to deal with very different scenarios, probably a much more fragmented world. Maybe we're going to miss nationalism when it's gone because it gave a sense of security. It's very hard to tell. So I recommend the book. Some of the chapters start with Daniele and see what you find. And it's free, it's downloadable, and it's brand new. It came out just a few months ago.
It's kind of hard to imagine hyper-local communities as the highest level of organizations. Is that what you'd imagine be the node that, sort of in this sideways network? Is that the node? It's kind of a village or a city, or is it bigger than that? Kind of cantonal? I don't know.
Good question. Great question, okay. And I can't answer. I think it can be many things, but the point is that you need people need to identify. They need to feel at home. I mean, my research on the environmental movement in Australia shows that, and on people in industrial cities in Australia show, as many others research has also shown, that charity begins at home. Engagement begins with that which is experienced. So some of those environmental activists that I met in Australia, they were quite oblivious to or indifferent before they started to feel these effects on their own bodies. They might get asthma, they might get illness because of emissions from industry. They noticed that dead fish and even dead dolphins were washing up on the shore. And they felt that, something is not right. There's something here that's not telling us. And from that local engagement, they began to scale up and sideways. So before you knew it, they were interested in the tar sands in Alberta, in monocultural agriculture in South Africa. and the extinction of various species in Asia and so on. So that is a good place to begin. And it can begin in the community, it can begin in an NGO or somewhere else. But the point is that you need to have that node which gives you identification. The very intelligent and interesting and always worth reading journalist George Monbiot, who writes regularly for The Guardian and also published a number of books, and who's also concerned with global issues. He wrote some years ago a book where he advocated the world government, the global government, that sort of could take care of these things. My faith in that is limited. I don't think it would have legitimacy. In Europe, European integration didn't really lead to the kind of strong European identity that many had hoped for. In the early 90s, after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, where the European community was transformed into the European Union, a European football team, we haven't really seen that, have we? People still, they root for their own. But one big point here about football and identity is that to some of us, the club is much more important than the national team. Right, and in some ways you scale sideways when you compare your English club to the ones they have in Germany and so on. So we can think much more deterritorialized about these things. And in fact, earlier this evening, or to you, it'll be late afternoon, my son and I have a game to watch, and we're going to watch it in a deterritorialized way because he lives in Switzerland and I live in Oslo. So we're going to WhatsApp as the game goes on and share our frustrations. So we can use the new technologies to think about ways of producing these identities, but they're not going to replace the others, because the Benedict Anderson story is just one. And that's where we went wrong, some of us, in the 90s. We were too concerned, with the media, where you get information, what kind of communication networks you got. And we somehow forgot to think about the material foundations of nationalism, which are powerful, which are economic, which are infrastructure, which is taxation, boundaries, borders, that kind of thing, and they're not going away immediately. So the situation is fairly. I'd say that the situation is fairly open, but there is an inertia in the material infrastructure that should not be underestimated, and some of us did that in the 1990s. But when that collapses, then lots of things will fall apart.
Do you think? You're not sure that a world government would ever work, but do you think the UN will ever regain its power? As maybe you mentioned that it's lost it in the last 20 or 30 years. Do you think that can come back?
The pendulum can swing back regarding, multilateral and global cooperation, and it probably will have to. But it looks quite bleak now, doesn't it? 2022 was not a good year for international solidarity, was it? We've had many setbacks. You had Trump, you had Brexit, you had Viktor Orban, and now you have the Russians, who are basically withdrawing and trying to build alliances with China and possibly India, and so on and so forth. And so the world seems more fragmented now, and less based on trust and more on suspicion than it was, say, in the 1970s. So, which was a golden era for multilateralism and solidarity. But the pendulum can swing back, and as I'm saying, this may have to happen. But it's not going to happen on its own. But it may happen through resistance and through protest and through demands. One interesting concept that has come into the world recently is climate justice. Think about those 30, 40 million Pakistanis who have lost everything because of flooding. And many of them know that this is connected to lots of things, but one of the things to which it is connected is global climate change. And they're quite innocent. They haven't contributed much. They have a carbon footprint of a little above zero, whereas people in Los Angeles, in London, in Oslo, have a vast carbon footprint. So we should pay. The polluter pays. And that kind of way of thinking, which again, it sort of breaks the bond, the umbilical cord, between individual and the nation state, because it reveals the need for transnational solutions and international solutions. And if this is not going to happen, some of those people might get fed up with us and start to behave nasty. Climate terrorism is still something that belongs to fiction, but I wonder how long that's going to last. So So we live in interesting times, Monty, and it's a time of transition.
Brilliant. Well, I think we should end it there unless anyone has one last quick question.
I'd be happy to go back to my sofa actually if you ask, because I'm running out of steam now. But it's been great.
Yeah, we'll leave
thanks
it there.
so much for the invitation, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to reflect a bit more on these issues that we write
so
about.
much.
I mean, both Danielle and I and others are writing about these things now, and there is a connection here with the kind of things that you do, which we should be aware of. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because it's really about different
ways
of organizing a society. Will do, I hope. We'll never know. Anyway.
Yeah, we'll see. Enjoy.
Cheers, bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, bye.